Snow covered the ground above, but beneath lay a network of tunnels so dark and cold that bone itself seemed to freeze. Breath turned to thin mist in the narrow passageways, where every sound echoed twice as far. When enemy boots hammered down through the hatch entrance, she stood at the underground crossroads and shouted, "I surrender!" The gunfire paused. The enemy hesitated, then laughed quietly, believing their prey had finally collapsed. No one realized they had just walked into a trap dug long ago. 10 minutes later, the tunnels fell into absolute silence. Not a single enemy soldier remained alive. The tunnel system had been built decades earlier, part of a defensive network that most military historians had forgotten existed. Maps showed 3 main passages and 2 emergency exits. Reality was far more complicated. Corporal Grace Hartley pressed her back against the frozen stone wall, her rifle clutched across her chest. The temperature down here hovered just above freezing, warm enough to keep the passages open, cold enough to make every breath painful. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. Each drop struck stone with a sound like a small hammer, magnified by the acoustic properties of the confined space. Her ears had learned to filter out the constant dripping, focusing instead on the sounds that mattered: movement, voices, the metallic click of weapons being readied. The main passage stretched 15 feet wide at its broadest point, narrowing to barely 3 feet in places where cave-ins had partially blocked the way. Side tunnels branched off every 30 yards or so, some leading to storage chambers, others to dead ends where the original builders had abandoned their work. Grace had been down here for 6 hours. The collapse happened at dawn. Her unit had been conducting a routine patrol through the valley when artillery fire rained down from the ridge. The snow, already heavy from 3 days of storms, had been destabilized. Within minutes, half the mountainside came sliding down. She'd been near the entrance to the old tunnel system when it happened. Training took over. She dove through the rusted gate just as the avalanche roared past, sealing the entrance behind her with tons of packed snow and ice. The emergency radio had survived the initial blast, but the range was worthless down here. Stone walls ate signals. She'd tried for an hour before accepting the truth. She was alone. Not entirely alone, as it turned out. The enemy patrol had been searching for survivors. They'd found the secondary entrance, a ventilation shaft that emerged behind a stand of pine trees half a mile from where the main gate had been buried. Grace had heard them before she saw them. The scrape of equipment against stone, voices speaking in clipped, efficient tones. 12 soldiers, maybe 15. She had 19 rounds left in her rifle, plus 1 partially loaded magazine in her vest. No grenades, no backup weapon except a combat knife that would be useless in a direct confrontation. The tunnels offered 2 advantages: darkness and knowledge. She'd studied these passages during her first week stationed in this region. Most soldiers skimmed the briefing materials and moved on. Grace had spent 3 evenings poring over the old survey maps, cross-referencing them with geological reports and maintenance logs from the tunnel's construction. She knew where the passages connected, where they narrowed, where sound carried, and where it died. The enemy had numbers and firepower. She had terrain. The dripping water continued its rhythm. Grace moved deeper into the tunnel system, away from the secondary entrance where the enemy would soon emerge. Her boots made almost no sound on the stone floor, a trick she'd learned during urban combat training. Roll from heel to toe, keep your weight centered, test each step before committing. The tunnel curved left, then split. She took the right-hand passage, counting her steps in the darkness. 60 paces. The ceiling dropped lower here, forcing her to duck. Her right hand traced the wall, feeling for the mark she remembered from the maps. A surveyor's chisel cut, 3 lines crossed by 1 diagonal. There. She turned into a side passage so narrow her shoulders nearly brushed both walls. This was one of the abandoned sections, a tunnel that led nowhere. But 30 feet down this dead end, there was a crack in the wall, a natural fissure that connected to the parallel passage. Grace squeezed through, feeling stones scrape against her vest. On the other side, she paused, listening. Voices echoed from the main tunnel. The enemy had entered the system. "Spread out," someone ordered. "Check every passage. She can't have gone far." Footsteps scattered in multiple directions. Grace allowed herself a thin smile in the darkness. They'd just made their first mistake. Lieutenant Marcus Reeves led the search team through the tunnel entrance with the confidence of a man who'd conducted 100 similar operations. The thermal scope mounted on his rifle showed nothing but cold stone and colder air. No heat signatures. No movement. "Thermal's clean," he reported into his radio. "Target must be deeper in the system." "Copy that," came the response. "Second squad is moving to secure the western branch. Third squad will hold the entrance." Reeves gestured to his team. 8 soldiers, all experienced in underground combat. They'd cleared bunker complexes in 3 different countries. A few old tunnels didn't concern him. Jensen, take point. Martinez, your rear guard. Everyone else maintain spacing. Watch for tripwires and pressure plates. They moved forward in practiced formation. Jensen's flashlight beam swept the tunnel ahead, revealing rough-hewn stone walls and a floor littered with debris from decades of neglect. Water dripped steadily from cracks in the ceiling. "Contact!" someone yelled from a side passage. Gunfire erupted, the sound deafening in the confined space. Reeves's ears rang even through his hearing protection. He pivoted toward the sound, bringing his rifle up. "Report!" "Saw movement," a voice crackled over the radio. "Western Junction. Target retreated down passage 4. "Pursue," Reeves ordered. "Don't let her gain distance." 3 soldiers peeled off, running toward the Western Junction. Reeves could hear their boots echoing through multiple passages simultaneously, an acoustic trick that made it sound like the soldiers were everywhere at once. He frowned. Something felt wrong. "All units, slow down," he said into his radio. "Maintain formation. Don't—" A scream cut through the channel, then silence. "Harris? Report. Harris, do you copy?" "Nothing." Reeves' grip tightened on his rifle. "Second squad, what's your status?" "Static." "Third squad?" "Entrance secured," came the reply. "No activity here." The tunnel suddenly felt smaller, darker. Reeves scanned the passage ahead, then behind. His thermal scope showed nothing but ambient temperature, no heat signatures. Where was she? A sound echoed from somewhere deep in the tunnel system. It took him a moment to identify it. Laughter. Quiet. Brief, then silence. "Lights out," he ordered. "Switch to night vision. Thermal only." The flashlights clicked off. In the sudden darkness, Reeves became aware of how loud his own breathing sounded, the water dripping, the slight scrape of equipment against stone as his soldiers shifted position. They were being hunted. Grace had been 14 when she'd first learned that sound could kill. Not the philosophical concept, the literal physical reality. She'd been in the basement of her family's farmhouse during a tornado, listening to the world tear itself apart overhead. The tornado never touched their property, but in the basement, pressed against the foundation wall, she'd felt the vibrations of its passage through the ground itself. Later, she'd learned that certain frequencies could shatter glass, collapse structures, disorient human balance. Sound was just pressure waves. In the right environment, pressure became a weapon. Her instructor at sniper school had recognized the aptitude during a training exercise. While other candidates focused on wind speed and bullet drop, Grace had been calculating sound delay, the gap between a gunshot and the moment a target would hear it, the echo patterns that could reveal a shooter's position. "You think about space differently," the instructor had told her. "Most shooters see distance. You see sound." She'd specialized in urban combat after that. Buildings created vertical sound channels. Stairwells amplified certain frequencies while dampening others. A trained ear could track movement through 6 floors of concrete based solely on acoustic signatures. Tunnels were simpler. Sound moved in predictable patterns here. It bounced, reflected, created ghost echoes that made one person sound like 3. But if you understood the geometry, you could use those reflections to know exactly where everyone was. Grace crouched in a side chamber, eyes closed, listening. 4 soldiers in the main passage, moving north. 3 more in the western branch, approaching the junction where she'd shown herself briefly. 2 guarding the entrance. She'd heard Harris die, not the death itself, but the moment before. The sharp intake of breath, the scramble of boots as he'd tried to backpedal, then the crack as his head met stone in a passage where the ceiling dropped to 5 feet without warning. His night vision had shown him a clear path, but night vision didn't reveal vertical clearance. 1 down, 14 to go. Grace opened her eyes. Her hands moved through practiced motions, checking her equipment. 19 rounds, a half-empty canteen. 3 emergency flares that she'd considered using for light but had decided against. Fire consumed oxygen, and these tunnels were poorly ventilated. She pulled out her knife instead. The blade was 7 inches of carbon steel, non-reflective coating serrated along one edge. Not her first choice for combat, but it had advantages: silence, reliability, and the psychological impact of forcing an enemy to fight at arm's length. The voices grew louder in the main passage. Grace counted 3 distinct speakers. They'd stopped moving, probably conferring about what to do next. She picked up a small stone and tossed it down a side tunnel. The clatter echoed in 4 different directions simultaneously. She heard the soldiers react, weapons raised, lights scanning. "Did you hear that? Southwest passage, move." 2 soldiers broke off from the group, following the sound. Grace waited until their footsteps faded, then slipped out of her chamber and moved north, parallel to the remaining soldiers' position, but 1 tunnel over. The passages connected ahead. She counted her steps in the darkness, her internal map perfectly aligned with reality. 40 paces. The wall would open into a wider chamber. The soldier would have to pass through there to continue north. She arrived first. The soldier came through the archway 30 seconds later, his light sweeping the empty chamber. He saw nothing. Grace stood 3 feet behind him, having entered through the secondary passage while his attention was focused forward. She moved. The blade went in below the shoulder blade, angled upward. He gasped, but didn't scream. Her other hand had clamped over his mouth before the knife struck. 7 seconds of struggle, then stillness. Grace lowered the body to the ground carefully, quietly. She took his radio and ammunition, leaving the rifle. Too distinctive a sound. Then she retreated back through the passage she'd entered from. 2 down. Lieutenant Reeves knew they were in trouble when Corporal Stevens stopped responding to radio calls. "All units consolidate at the main junction," he ordered. "We're pulling back to the entrance." "Sir, the target is a single soldier with limited ammunition. We have 12 operators. But this terrain gives her every advantage. We regroup, we reassess, we call in support." It was the right tactical decision. Reeves had made a career of right tactical decisions. But as his team began moving back toward the entrance, he felt that wrongness intensify. The tunnel acoustics were playing tricks on him. He could hear footsteps that sounded close but must have been far away. Water dripping in rhythms that seemed almost intentional. His own breathing. "Movement!" someone shouted. "Eastern Passage!" Gunfire erupted. Muzzle flashes lit the tunnel in stuttering snapshots. When the shooting stopped, no one had hit anything. "Cease fire," Reeves ordered. "You're wasting ammunition on echoes." But the psychological damage was done. His soldiers were firing at sounds now, at shadows, exactly what the enemy wanted. They reached the main junction in a defensive cluster. 9 soldiers left, minus the 2 guarding the entrance. Reeves did a quick head count to confirm. 8. "Where's Patterson?" No one answered. They had been together 30 seconds ago. The tunnel had swallowed one of them without anyone noticing. "Back to back," Reeves ordered. "Lights on all directions. Nothing moves without someone seeing it." They formed a defensive circle. 8 lights pointing outward, 8 rifles ready. The dripping water continued. Grace watched from a maintenance shaft above the junction. The shaft, barely wide enough for her shoulders, opened into the ceiling of the main chamber. The survey maps had called it a ventilation channel, though it clearly served multiple purposes during the tunnel's original construction. She'd taken Patterson in a side passage while the group was transitioning through a narrow section. He'd been last in line, and the soldier ahead of him hadn't noticed Patterson had stopped following until 30 seconds later. By then, Grace was already climbing into the shaft. 8 soldiers left, plus 2 at the entrance. The mathematics were simple. She had 14 rounds remaining. Even if every shot was perfect, and underground tunnel combat made perfection impossible, she'd run out of ammunition before running out of targets. So ammunition wasn't the solution. The tunnel was. Grace studied the defensive circle below. They'd chosen their position well. Good sightlines in 4 directions, backs protected by being clustered together. But they'd made one critical mistake. They were standing directly below the main water channel. The channel ran through the ceiling for 300 feet, collecting runoff from dozens of smaller passages. During normal conditions, it drained steadily through cracks and joints. But there was a control point, a crude valve system the original builders had installed for maintenance. Grace crawled backward through the shaft, moving carefully to avoid dislodging loose stone. It took 3 minutes to reach the valve chamber, another minute to assess the mechanism. The valve wheel was rusted solid. She braced her feet against the wall and pulled. Nothing. She adjusted her grip, pulled harder. The rust cracked with a sound like breaking ice. Below, someone said, "Did you hear that?" Grace spun the wheel. Water began flowing immediately, not a flood, but a steady stream that poured through the cracks in the junction chamber ceiling. "Sir, we're getting wet." "Ignore it. Stay focused on the passages." The water pooled on the floor. Within a minute, it was ankle deep. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably, but maintained their formation. Grace pulled her last flare from her vest. She'd been saving it for exactly this moment. She struck the flare and dropped it through a crack in the ceiling. The flare hit the water with a sharp hiss. Bright red light erupted in the junction chamber, reflecting off the wet stone walls and ceiling. The sudden illumination after minutes of relative darkness was blinding. The soldiers reacted instinctively, turning toward the light, raising hands to shield their eyes, breaking their defensive circle. Grace fired through the ceiling cracks. One shot, one soldier dropped. The others scattered, running for the passages leading out of the junction. Grace tracked them by sound, firing twice more. 1 hit, 1 miss. Then her rifle clicked empty. She dropped the weapon and pulled her knife. Seconds countdown. 8 minutes had passed since she'd shouted, "I surrender." 5 soldiers remained, plus the 2 guards at the entrance, but they were no longer a factor. Grace had heard Lieutenant Reeves order them to hold position no matter what. They wouldn't abandon their post without direct orders. 5 active threats in the tunnel system. Grace moved through the passages like water, flowing around obstacles, taking paths of least resistance. She'd abandoned her rifle. Too much weight, too much noise. The knife was enough. She found the next soldier in a narrow passage, his back pressed against the wall, rifle trained on the darkness ahead. He never thought to check behind. 4. The next one was harder. He'd found a defensive position in a storage chamber with only one entrance. Smart. But the chamber had ventilation, and ventilation meant access. 3. Lieutenant Reeves realized he'd lost contact with everyone except Corporal Jensen and Private Morrison. 3 soldiers left from a 12-man team. "Morrison, where are you?" "Western Passage, near the cave-in." "Jensen?" "Main tunnel. I can see the entrance from here." Reeves took a breath. "We're leaving, both of you. Move to the entrance. We're not equipped for this fight." "Copy," Jensen said. Morrison didn't respond. "Morrison?" Silence. Reeves ran toward the Western Passage, weapon raised. He found Morrison slumped against the wall, unconscious. No visible wounds. Grace had used the butt of her knife to strike the pressure point behind his ear, a technique that could drop a man without killing him. Reeves pressed his fingers against Morrison's neck. Still breathing, he grabbed the soldier's vest and started dragging him toward the entrance. 2 soldiers left, himself and Jensen. 9 minutes. Grace emerged from a side passage 20 feet from the entrance. She could see the 2 guards standing watch, backs to the tunnel, scanning the snow-covered landscape outside for threats. Jensen stood between her and the guards, his rifle trained on the passage Reeves would emerge from. She picked up a stone and threw it down the opposite passage. Jensen spun toward the sound. Grace moved. She covered the distance in 4 seconds. Jensen heard her at the last moment and tried to turn, but she was already inside his guard. Her knife went into his thigh, not a killing strike, but disabling. He fell, and she caught his rifle before it clattered against the stone. The 2 guards turned at the sound of Jensen's grunt. Grace fired twice. Both dropped. Lieutenant Reeves emerged from the side passage, dragging Morrison. He saw Jensen on the ground, saw the 2 guards down, saw Grace standing with Jensen's rifle. He dropped Morrison and raised his weapon. They both fired. Reeves's shot went wide. The stress, the darkness, the acoustic confusion throwing off his aim. Grace's shot hit his shoulder, spinning him around. He hit the wall hard and slid down, his rifle clattering away. 10 minutes. Grace walked to where Reeves sat, one hand pressed against his bleeding shoulder. She picked up his rifle and ejected the magazine, tossing both away into the darkness. "You killed my team," Reeves said through gritted teeth. "Harris died from a head injury. Stevens and 3 others are unconscious. 2 are dead. Morrison and Jensen will survive if you get them medical attention soon." Reeves stared at her. You were counting casualties?" "I was counting everything." Grace moved to the entrance and looked out at the snow-covered landscape. Dawn was breaking, turning the white expanse golden. She could see movement in the distance, her unit, digging through the avalanche debris. She turned back to Reeves. "When you entered these tunnels, you assumed you were the hunter. That was your first mistake. Your second was not understanding that down here, space isn't measured in distance. It's measured in sound, in angles, in what you can't see. You said you surrendered." "I did. To the terrain. To the reality that I couldn't fight 12 soldiers in open ground. But down here?" She gestured at the tunnels behind her. "Down here, I only had to fight 1 soldier at a time, and I knew exactly where each of you would be." Reeves slumped against the wall. "The whole thing was planned. From the moment you entered, every shot you fired told me where you were. Every time you split up, you made yourselves easier targets. The tunnels did most of the work. I just guided the process." "Why didn't you kill me?" Grace considered the question. "Because this was never about killing. It was about surviving. You just happened to be in my way." She heard voices from outside, her unit calling her name. She raised her hand and shouted back, then looked at Reeves one last time. "You should leave these tunnels. They're dangerous if you don't know what you're doing." Then she walked out into the sunlight. Captain Sarah Mitchell found Grace sitting on a boulder 50 yards from the tunnel entrance, cleaning her knife with snow. Behind her, medical teams were extracting the enemy soldiers. Some wounded, some unconscious, 2 dead. "Corporal Hartley," Mitchell said. "Are you injured?" "No, ma'am. We lost your signal when the avalanche hit. We thought—" Mitchell trailed off. "How many were there?" 12 in the tunnels, 2 more arrived later. Mitchell looked at the scene behind them. Enemy soldiers being loaded onto stretchers, equipment scattered across the snow. "And you handled all of them alone?" "I had help." Grace gestured at the tunnel entrance. "The terrain did most of the work." "That's not what Lieutenant Reeves told us. He said you were waiting for them, that you'd turned the entire tunnel system into some kind of trap." Grace shrugged. I knew the layout. They didn't. In a confined space, knowledge is better than firepower. A medic approached. "Ma'am, we need to check her for injuries." Mitchell nodded. As the medic began his examination, she studied Grace's face. No fear, no visible stress, just calm focus. "What were you thinking?" Mitchell asked quietly, "when they first entered the tunnels?" Grace was silent for a moment, then, "I was thinking that they'd made a mistake, and that mistakes down there tend to be fatal." The medic finished his examination. "She's fine, dehydrated, some minor scrapes, but nothing serious." Mitchell dismissed him and sat down next to Grace. "You're going to be asked a lot of questions about what happened down there." "I understand." "They're going to want to know how one soldier managed to neutralize an entire enemy patrol unit." "I didn't neutralize all of them. Most are still alive." "That's not the point. The point is—" Mitchell stopped, searching for words. "What you did down there was remarkable and terrifying. You understand that, right?" Grace looked at her commanding officer. "Permission to speak freely?" "Granted." "Ma'am, I was trapped in a dark tunnel system with an enemy patrol hunting me. I used the tools I had available. That's all." "That's all?" "That's all." Mitchell shook her head. "You're either the most humble soldier I've ever met, or you genuinely don't understand what you just accomplished." "I survived. That was the goal." They sat in silence for a moment, watching as the last of the enemy soldiers was carried from the tunnel. Reeves emerged on his own feet, his shoulder bandaged, escorted by 2 military police. He saw Grace and stopped. They locked eyes across the snow. Then Reeves nodded, a small gesture, but unmistakable, respect from one soldier to another. Grace nodded back. "What did he say to you?" Mitchell asked, "before we extracted him?" "He asked why I didn't kill him." "What did you tell him?" "That it wasn't necessary. This was never about killing. It was about making them understand they'd chosen the wrong battlefield." Mitchell stood up. "Come on, command wants a full debrief. And Corporal?" "Ma'am?" "Next time you decide to turn a tunnel system into a death trap, at least try to keep me informed." Grace allowed herself a small smile. "I'll do my best, ma'am." That evening, Grace sat in the debriefing room with 3 senior officers. They'd been questioning her for 2 hours, going over every detail of the engagement. "Let's go back to the beginning," Colonel Anderson said. "The moment the enemy patrol entered the tunnel, you shouted that you were surrendering. Why?" "Because I wanted them to enter." "Explain." Grace leaned forward. "When I realized I was trapped in the tunnel system with an enemy patrol approaching, I had 3 options. First, try to escape through one of the emergency exits, but those were likely buried by the avalanche. Second, hide and wait for rescue, but that meant the enemy would either find me or establish control of the tunnels, making extraction difficult. Third option, make them think I was helpless and lure them in." "So the surrender was bait?" "Yes, sir. But it was also psychological warfare. A soldier who surrenders is scared, out of options, defeated. That mindset makes the enemy overconfident. They stop treating the situation as dangerous." Major Davis spoke up. "But you risked them just shooting you immediately." "That was a calculated risk. Military protocol generally prohibits executing prisoners, especially if extraction is possible. They had the numbers and the firepower to take me alive. The logical choice was to accept my surrender and bring me back for interrogation." "Which is exactly what they tried to do," Anderson said. "Yes, sir. They entered the tunnels believing they were in control of the situation. By the time they realized their mistake, they were already committed." "Committed to what?" "To fighting in an environment they didn't understand. Every step they took deeper into the tunnels, I had more advantages. I knew the layout, I knew how sound traveled, I knew where the passages narrowed, where the ceilings dropped, where the intersections created acoustic confusion." Davis pulled out a map. "Show us." Grace stood and approached the map, which showed the tunnel system in detail. She pointed to the main entrance. "They entered here. Standard patrol formation, point man, main group, rear guard. They made their first mistake immediately. They split up to cover more ground. That's good tactics in open terrain, but in tunnels, it means each group is isolated. Sound doesn't carry clearly between passages, so they couldn't support each other effectively." Her finger traced through the tunnel system. "I led them here, to this junction. Let them think they'd cornered me. Then I disappeared through a side passage they didn't know existed. That's when they really started to panic." "And that's when casualties began," Anderson said. "Yes, sir, but most of those weren't from direct combat. Harris died from a head injury when he ran through a low-ceiling passage. Stevens was incapacitated by a nerve strike. Patterson was knocked unconscious. I only killed 2 enemy soldiers, the ones who gave me no choice." "Why show restraint?" Grace met the colonel's eyes. "Because killing wasn't the objective. Survival was. Every soldier I killed was ammunition I couldn't recover, time I couldn't spare, noise that revealed my position. It was more efficient to disable them." "Efficient?" Anderson sat back. "You're describing combat like it's a math problem." In some ways it is. Resources, timing, positioning, it's all variables in an equation. The soldier who understands the math survives. Major Davis studied her. Where did you learn to think like this? Sniper school primarily, but also from my father. He was an engineer. He used to say that every system has weaknesses, but you can only exploit them if you understand how the system works. The tunnel was a system. I just understood it better than the enemy did. And the final moments? Anderson asked. When you confronted Lieutenant Reeves? By that point, the engagement was effectively over. Most of his team was down. He'd lost tactical cohesion. I could have let him retreat, but that would have meant leaving enemy soldiers in control of the entrance, so I ended it. You shot him. I disabled him. Shoulder wound, painful but not life-threatening. He'll recover full function within a few months. Anderson closed his folder. Corporal Hartley, what you did in those tunnels was extraordinary. 12 enemy soldiers neutralized by one operator with minimal ammunition and no support. It's going to be studied in tactical courses for years. Thank you, sir. But I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Anderson leaned forward. When you were down there in the dark, fighting for your life, were you scared? Grace was quiet for a moment. Then, yes, sir, I was terrified. But you fought anyway. I fought because I was terrified. Fear is just information. It tells you something's dangerous. What you do with that information is what matters. And what did you do with it? I turned it into fuel. Every time I felt scared, I reminded myself that the enemy was probably more scared. They were in unfamiliar territory, taking casualties, losing cohesion. My fear was rational. I knew the risks. Their fear was existential. They didn't understand what was happening. So I used that. Davis shook his head. You're either the most dangerous soldier I've ever met, or the most pragmatic. Maybe both, Grace said quietly. 3 days later, Grace stood at the entrance to the tunnel system. Engineers had shored up the damaged sections and restored power to the emergency lighting. The tunnels were safe now, as safe as underground passages could be. She'd come back alone, against protocol, but with Mitchell's quiet approval. There were things she needed to see. The junction chamber where she'd dropped the flare was empty now, cleaned of debris and blood. But she could still see it all in her mind, the red light reflecting off water, the moment of chaos, the sound of gunfire echoing through stone. She walked to the spot where Harris had died. Someone had marked the location with chalk, part of the investigation team's work. The low ceiling was obvious in the light. In darkness, with night vision gear, it would have been invisible until too late. Grace touched the stone where his head had struck. I'm sorry, she said quietly. She meant it. Harris hadn't been a bad soldier. He'd just been following orders, doing his job. The tunnel had killed him as surely as any bullet. She continued through the passages, visiting each location where the engagement had occurred. The storage chamber where she'd ambushed Stevens, the shaft she'd climbed to reach the valve chamber, the narrow passage where she'd taken Jensen down. At each spot, she stopped and remembered, not with pride or satisfaction, but with something closer to sorrow. 10 soldiers injured, 2 dead, all because they'd made the tactical decision to enter these tunnels, all because she'd invited them in. Having regrets? Grace turned. Mitchell stood at the entrance to the chamber, backlit by the tunnel lights. Permission to speak freely, ma'am? Always. I'm not sure what I'm feeling. Pride that I survived, guilt about the casualties, both, neither. Mitchell walked closer. You did what you had to do to survive. No one faults you for that. Harris's family might disagree. Harris knew the risks when he put on the uniform. We all do. Grace nodded but didn't respond. Mitchell studied her. You know what's going to happen now, right? They're going to want to turn you into a symbol, the soldier who beat impossible odds. They'll write articles, give you medals, use your story for recruitment. I don't want any of that. I know, but it's coming anyway. Mitchell sighed. For what it's worth, I think you handled an impossible situation as well as anyone could, better than most. You kept your head, used your training, and survived. That's what matters. Is it? It has to be. Because if we start second-guessing every decision made in combat, we'll never be able to function. You made choices. Some of those choices resulted in enemy casualties. But the alternative was your death. Given that choice, you picked the right option. Grace looked at the chalk mark on the floor, the spot where Stevens had fallen. He didn't have to die. No, but once the engagement began, casualties were inevitable. You minimized them. That's all any soldier can do. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Mitchell said, There's something else you should know. Lieutenant Reeves asked to speak with you. He's still being held for debriefing, but he made the request official. What does he want? He didn't say, but I think he wants to understand what happened down here. How one soldier dismantled his entire unit. Will you approve the meeting? Mitchell considered. Do you want it approved? Grace thought about Reeves, the professional soldier who'd made every right decision and still lost. She thought about the look in his eyes when she'd told him why she didn't kill him. Yes, she said finally, I think we both need that conversation. They met in a secured conference room at the forward operating base. Reeves sat across the table, his injured shoulder in a sling, 2 guards standing by the door. Grace entered and sat down. For a moment, neither spoke. "Your shoulder," Grace said finally. "How is it?" "Painful, but I'll recover." Reeves studied her. "How are you?" "Physically fine." "That's not what I asked." Grace met his eyes. "I'm dealing with it. Same as you." Reeves nodded slowly. "I've been replaying those tunnels in my head for 3 days. Every decision, every move, trying to figure out where we went wrong." "You didn't go wrong, you did everything right." "Then why did we lose?" "Because you were fighting the wrong battle. You thought you were conducting a patrol to capture an enemy soldier. You weren't. You were entering a kill zone that I'd been preparing since the moment I realized you were coming." Reeves leaned back. "The surrender call, that was the first move?" "Yes. Everything after that was just execution. I needed you inside the tunnels, confident and committed. The surrender did both. We should have stayed at the entrance, set up a perimeter and waited. You would have lost differently. My unit was digging through the avalanche. Give them another hour and they'd have broken through. You'd have been caught between 2 forces. So we were trapped no matter what we did." "No. You were trapped the moment you decided to enter. After that, every choice narrowed your options." Reeves was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I lost good soldiers in those tunnels." "I know." Harris was 23, engaged. His wedding was supposed to be next month. Grace felt something twist in her chest. "I'm sorry." "Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, you seem pretty comfortable with what happened." "I'm not comfortable. I'm functional. There's a difference." "Explain it to me." Grace chose her words carefully. "When I'm in combat, I exist in a specific mental state. Everything becomes tactical, threat assessment, resource management, environmental advantages. In that state, I can make the decisions that need to be made. But afterward, when I'm back here," she gestured at the room around them, "then I have to live with those decisions. That's when it gets hard." "So you do feel guilt." "I feel weight. The weight of choices made. Harris died because he chased me through a low-ceiling passage. I led him there, knowing it was dangerous. That's on me." "But you'd do it again." "If faced with the same situation, yes, because the alternative was my death. I chose to survive. I'll always choose that." Reeves studied her for a long moment. "You know what bothers me most? It's not that we lost. It's not even the casualties. It's that you made it look easy, like we never had a chance." "You didn't, not in that terrain." "How do you live with that certainty? That knowledge that you can dismantle an entire unit if the conditions are right?" Grace was quiet. Then, "The same way you live with giving orders that send soldiers into danger. We're both making choices that result in people getting hurt. The difference is context. Your choices serve your mission. Mine serve my survival. Neither of us is wrong. We're just on opposite sides. And if we meet again, on a different battlefield, then we adapt to that terrain and make the best decisions we can. That's all warfare is, a series of choices made under pressure. Sometimes you make the right choice and survive, sometimes you don't." Reeves flexed his injured shoulder, wincing. "I'm going to remember those tunnels for the rest of my life." "So will I. But you'll remember them as a victory." Grace shook her head. "I'll remember them as 10 minutes when everything balanced on a knife's edge. When one wrong move meant death. When I had to become something I'm not sure I'm comfortable being." She paused. "Victory isn't the word I'd use." "What word would you use?" "Survival, and the price it demanded." They sat in silence. Finally, Reeves said, "Thank you for not killing me. Thank you for giving me the choice." Reeves stood, the guards moving to escort him out. At the door, he turned back. "Corporal Hartley, I hope we never meet in combat again." "So do I, Lieutenant." The door closed. Grace sat alone in the conference room, staring at her hands. They were steady. They'd been steady in the tunnels, too. She wondered if that should worry her. 2 weeks later, Grace stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. The tunnel entrance was visible below, a dark opening in the white landscape like a wound that hadn't healed. Snow was falling again, heavy flakes that accumulated quickly, already erasing the tracks her patrol had made on the way up. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Mitchell had come up beside her quietly. "It would be if I could see it that way." "Still processing?" "Every day, every night." Mitchell was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know the official report cleared you of any wrongdoing." "I know. And you know that most soldiers in your situation would have died. What you did was extraordinary." "I keep hearing that. Extraordinary. Remarkable. Incredible." Grace turned to face Mitchell. "But it doesn't feel that way. It feels like I did what I had to do, like anyone would have." "But anyone wouldn't have. That's the point. You saw possibilities that others wouldn't have seen. You used terrain as a weapon. You turned a hopeless situation into a tactical victory." "At what cost?" "At the cost of enemy casualties, which is what combat is. Grace looked back at the tunnel entrance. I keep thinking about something Reeves said. He asked how I live with the certainty that I can dismantle a unit if conditions are right. And I realized I don't know if I can. Live with that certainty, I mean. What are you saying? I'm saying that in those tunnels I learned something about myself. I learned that when pushed far enough, I'm capable of things I didn't think I was capable of. And I'm not sure how I feel about that. Mitchell stepped closer. Listen to me. You're a soldier, a damn good one. What you did in those tunnels was what soldiers do. You adapted, improvised, survived. That's not something to be ashamed of. I'm not ashamed. Grace searched for the word. Wary of what I might become if I keep doing this. Then don't. Put in for a transfer, take a teaching position, get out of combat operations. Would you? Mitchell laughed quietly. No, because despite everything, despite the cost and the weight and the nightmares, this is what I'm good at. It's where I belong. She paused. The question is, where do you belong? Grace didn't answer immediately. She watched the snow fall, watched it accumulate and erase and transform the landscape into something clean and new. Finally, she said, I belong where I can use what I've learned, where the lessons from those tunnels mean something. Which is? Forward, always forward. The snow will keep falling, the terrain will keep changing, and I'll keep adapting. She turned to Mitchell. Because that's what survivors do. Mitchell nodded. Then let's get back to base. We've got new recruits coming in next week. Someone needs to teach them about unconventional tactics. They started down the ridge together. Behind them, the tunnel entrance disappeared into the falling snow, its secrets buried once again beneath white silence. Grace didn't look back. She'd spent enough time in the dark. 6 months later, at the Tactical Training Center, Grace stood before a class of new recruits. Behind her, a map of underground tunnel systems. Today we're talking about asymmetric warfare, she began. Specifically, how to survive when you're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. The recruit sat forward, attentive. The first thing you need to understand is that terrain is never neutral. Every environment has characteristics you can exploit. Underground systems, urban structures, forest canopies, they all have patterns. Your job is to recognize those patterns faster than your enemy does. She pointed to the tunnel map. Last winter I was trapped in a system similar to this one. Enemy patrol of 12 soldiers entered, intent on capturing or killing me. I had 19 rounds of ammunition and a knife. Standard tactical thinking says I had no chance. What happened? A recruit asked. Grace smiled thinly. I survived, they didn't. She spent the next hour breaking down the engagement, not glorifying it, but analyzing it. The psychological warfare, the acoustic manipulation, the way she'd used the terrain itself as a weapon. The key, she concluded, is understanding that combat isn't about fairness. It's about using every advantage you have. Knowledge, preparation, willingness to make hard choices. If you understand the battlefield better than your enemy, you control the engagement. After class, as the recruits filed out, one young soldier, Private Emma Rodriguez, lingered. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Go ahead. That story you told, about the tunnels, were you scared? Grace looked at the young woman. She saw herself 6 months earlier, capable but untested, confident but uncertain. Yes, she said honestly, I was terrified. But you fought anyway. I fought because I was terrified. Fear tells you something's dangerous. What you do with that information is what separates survivors from casualties. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Thank you, ma'am. That helps. As the recruit left, Grace turned back to the tunnel map. She could still see it all so clearly. The darkness, the cold, the sound of water dripping in the silence, the weight of choices made in disparate moments. But she could also see the lesson, the purpose. Those 10 minutes in the dark had taught her something essential about survival, about adaptation, about the human capacity to find advantages in impossible situations. She'd surrendered, and in surrendering, she'd won. Not through strength or numbers or firepower, but through understanding, through seeing what others missed, through turning the terrain itself into an ally. The snow had continued falling that day, covering everything, the tunnel entrance, the evidence of combat, the blood and the bodies and the aftermath. Nature's way of moving forward, of transforming violence into silence, into memory. Grace understood that now. You couldn't change what happened. You could only choose what came next. She picked up her teaching materials and headed for the door. Behind her, the tunnel map remained on the wall, a reminder, a warning, a lesson. In the right conditions, she'd written at the bottom, one soldier can change everything. She believed that. She'd lived it, and now she'd teach it to the next generation. The tunnels were behind her now, but the lessons would last forever.